Hello and welcome to TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, July 1st. We've got an unbelievable episode. We've got our good friend Jules Milner-Brage, the recent inventor and strongest advocate for the Beacon Street Bridle Path, which is a proposal to take sort of some relatively unused space along the T-tracks of the C line, running right along Beacon Street, and converting it to a long linear park. So we're going to have a great interview with him in just a few minutes. But first, the news. Hey, you made it to the second half of the year. And yeah, you might argue that there are 4 months with 31 days in the second half of the year and only 3 in the first half, plus February. And so we haven't actually made it to the halfway point. But don't confuse me with the facts. We're in July, we're cooking, and we are cooking. It's been really hot, both on the West Coast and on the East Coast. We do have some cooling stations kicking around, and so you should feel free to go to the Public Safety Building's community room, the Senior Center, and the 3 library locations if your home is uncomfortably warm. And by uncomfortable, that I might mean dangerous, right? So if you're a little uncomfortable, take off your shoes and socks, have a glass of lemonade, but we're at the point where it might be dangerous, and we need to take care of ourselves and each other. So do head to a cooling station if that's appropriate for you. But as I said, let's do the news. Nationally, President Biden has reached a compromise on his infrastructure plans with a bipartisan group of senators. And the agreed upon framework will cost about $1.2 trillion and focus on roads, electric vehicles, and broadband. My hope is that they find other uses as well. We do have plenty of needs. Friday, Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison for murdering George Floyd last May. He can get out as early as on 2/3, so he will serve a minimum of 15 years. In Massachusetts, we're the second highest vaccination rate state in the country after Vermont having passed 70% and climbing. If you have not been vaccinated and you are 12 years old or older, let's figure out how to get that done. If I can be of help, reach out to me. I have helped a couple of constituents with vaccine appointments, but at this point, it's easy to get an appointment. It's easy to walk in. You just need to do it, and I encourage you to do so. Last week, the House passed Chapter 90 funding, holding the $200 million per year spent on roads constant as compared to past years. But the House added $75 million of additional funding, $25 million each of incremental spending for the Small Bridges Program, Public Transit Buses Enhancement Program, and Subway and Commuter Rail Enhancements Program. The Country Club of Brookline will be hosting the 2022 U.S. Open, the first time it's been held in Massachusetts in more than 30 years. Tickets are now on sale at the USGA website, and I'm under the understanding that you can volunteer for the U.S. Open. You've got to poke around and find the details of that on your own. We are, as I said, in the middle of a heat emergency that isn't expected to let up until today. Hopefully it cools off by today. Let's hang tight, stay cool, and as I said, use those publicly accessible cooling stations or other places. Look, the Coolidge Corner Theater is open. That's a place to go cool off for a couple of hours. Lots of options. Coming up on July 10th at 7 p.m., the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site will honor the 100th anniversary of the birth of Eunice Kennedy Shriver with a film presentation featuring biographers, Special Olympics representatives, and disability rights advocates and historians who will speak to Mrs. Shriver's life and legacy. And finally, this past Saturday, Congressman Auchincloss was in town. He met with residents in JFK Crossing after biking the Beacon Street Bridle Path and touring the Coolidge Corner Theater. What is this bridle path? Stay tuned to find out. We're going to cut over to our pre-recorded interview with Jules Milner-Brage. You'll love it. Thanks for watching. And as promised, today here on Brookline Interactive Group, we've got what I think is a fan favorite, Jules Milner-Bragi, and we're going to talk about the bridle path, which is both a long-standing idea and novel and exciting. Jules, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Tommy. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So, Jules, as you know, during the pandemic, weddings were way down. And so now we've got this bridle path to get us back on track for, the union of two adults who want to spend the rest of their life together. Is that what we're talking about here?
Not so fast, Tommy. That is a common misconception, but it's B-R-I-D-L-E, not D-A-L.
So we're building a path for horses. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, so the bridle there refers to someone riding on horseback and using their reins to guide their horse. And it's a reference to the history of the space along the middle of Beacon Street that was originally designed and built and used for a time between about 1890 to about 1930, from the best information that I've been able to see, and with some background from the Brookline Historical Society folks, Ken Liss et al., John Dempsey. So that it was a horseback riding way that was distinct from the carriageways which existed on Beacon Street and the sidewalks which existed on Beacon Street. And so that's where the bridle comes from. And I think the concept is that it could really have relevance. This 19th century design and space that once existed could have relevance in the 21st century for a variety of modes of transportation that are kind of similar to horseback riding. That is to say, smaller than a carriage, a little faster than walking, but not the same as walking. So horseback riding could be analogous to bicycling, or a child riding a kick scooter, or even a person jogging on foot, not on a horse.
So when we talk about the bridle path, we're talking about the space between the two roadways of Beacon Street. Is that the space we're talking about?
That's right. So it's sort of, in the Olmsted design for Beacon Street, there were essentially two different ways along the middle of the street. On the outer edges of the street were the sidewalks. Stepping inward were two different carriageways. And then in the middle of the street was a two-directional railway, which is now the MBTA's Green Sea Line. And then next to it was a two-directional bridleway. So actually it was those pair of things that were in the middle. So in effect, it's the space that the bridleway historically is now under the angled car parking spots in the middle of Beacon Street in Brookline.
So under those, but also maybe there's some landscaping between the parking and the rail, depending on sort of exactly where you are. But in different parts of Beacon Street, people really like that parking, or at least some people do. I don't think I've ever parked there, but other people have. And Jules, you've been active in Brookline long enough to know that proposing the elimination of hundreds of parking spaces rarely ends well for the proposer. Some have even had to leave town as a result of such a proposal. But is that what you're doing? Is that, are you saying we should just get rid of hundreds of angled parking spaces for this?
So that's one of the interesting and exciting things about the design of Beacon Street, and I think the opportunity for this particular project is that it seems, based on preliminary study that I did in collaboration with Professor Peter Firth at Northeastern and his student Jackson Lynch, and that was in collaboration with a number of advisory committees to the Transportation Board, the Bicycle Advisory Committee, and we consulted with the Public Transportation Advisory Committee, Pedestrian Advisory Committee, and the Tree Planting Committee. But that preliminary investigation seems to indicate that there is actually the ability to restore at least a portion of that historical right-of-way without eliminating the parking spaces, but rather moving them, shifting them outward away from those trees. And just a quick sidebar, you're absolutely right. The trees on Beacon Street are such an essential part of both the Olmsted design and its current form. So this is really, we're not talking about cutting down the trees, certainly. And in fact, it's partly about getting people in a position where they can to benefit even more from those beautiful trees that run on either side of those MBTA train tracks. In any event, part of the reason why it seems, and the town is actually now with consultants, tool design, working on exploring this more with a feasibility study that's happening right now. But the basis, it seems, for not having to eliminate those parking spots, but rather shift them, is that in that original Olmsted design of the street, there was the wider side and the narrow side. And on the narrower side, that's the side where there aren't the median parking spots, there are 2 lanes of carriage traffic. And those were actually originally 1 lane in each direction on the narrow side, rather than both in the same direction. And then on the other side, there were 4 lanes. So the Olmsteds designed one side of the street to have considerably more carriage travel lanes. There were 4, 2 in each direction. And so now that our modern usage of Beacon Street has consolidated both sides as having just 2 lanes of carriage traffic, now going each in one direction, that there's essentially what used to be 2 lanes of carriage traffic that is next to what used to be the median bridleway. And that space, it seems that space is a place where we can essentially shift those median car parking stalls in such a way that keeps the car parking stalls and keeps travel lanes and keeps the parallel parking at the outer edge of the street, while reinserting, if you will, at least some version of a median pathway for non-car, non-train use between the parking stalls and the trees next to the train tracks.
So at its sort of foundation, at its initial design, it sounds like your observation was that paved space between where the angled parking cars end up and that rumble strip that is just sort of there to help the drivers kind of orient their car, and not anything else, could be used to benefit the community in a different way, right? But I want to actually take a step back, respectfully, right? I mean, Olmsted had this idea 100 years ago. It's not your idea to do some sort of moderate speed travel in the middle. And certainly there were folks at the turn of the millennium, this most recent turn of the millennium, 20 odd years ago, who were saying, why don't we put bikes in the median? And in fact, as I recall conversations as when I was a member of the Bicycle Advisory Committee, folks who were motorists and wanted bicyclists to have safe spaces, but not necessarily to compete with those spaces, said, well, why don't you put the bikes in the middle of Beacon Street? And the conversation never really progressed. It was always, that seems like a good idea, but they don't fit. So how do they fit? What did you bring to this that what nobody was able to bring 20 years ago? How do we get over that hump?
That's a great question. And it is so important to acknowledge that this is sort of like a multi-generational project to get to the point of studying it with consultants and exploring making this restoration possible now. So I think the part that I brought was, seeing what others have seen, I think, which is Beacon Street. It's notable, the train tracks don't run in the middle of the street. They're shifted to one side. Why? Why are they shifted to one side? It's not because there are parking spaces there. The parking spaces are kind of our latter day use for a space that existed before. And so there was just enough, I think, to see the possibility. And, the thing that I really was excited about and the challenge was to go and look at, well, what would it take to restore some minimal version of this right of way again? What are the barriers? What's accreted over time that's in the way of what used to be this kind of like continuous right of way? And the exciting part is, as you said, Tommy, when you look at the pavement where next to that row of trees, there's just so much. The vast majority of the street is already paved such that when there aren't cars in those stalls, you can walk or bike along next to those trees. And the trick is to really go and look at all of the intersections, all of the curb bulb outs at those intersections, the position of, there are street light poles that run along median, which actually are positioned outset of where the path would likely be. And so there was, as part of that very preliminary feasibility study undertaken by myself with Peter Firth and Jackson Lynch in collaboration with the Transportation Board Advisory Committees, we went through and actually looked again at the CAD model of Beacon Street when it was last renovated, which we were fortunate to be able to get access to from the Department of Public Works folks in Brookline, and was systematically went through and looked at that as a model of what was in existence during that turn of the 20th century, 21st century last renovation, and looking.
So forgive me, I'm going to interrupt for a second. I was imagining, I think viewers were imagining, you went out to the street and, block by block, step by step, you looked at what was there and maybe did some sketches and photographs and thought about how this path would fit. But you said CAD model. What are you talking about?
That's a great question, a great point. And actually, you're right. The first step was systematically going through the street block by block, intersection by intersection. I've got, if you look on my phone from the period in time in summer of 2017, when I was really exploring this, it's just like hundreds and hundreds of photos of a yellow tape measure stretched across the street, looking at every single street light pole and measuring exactly where the trees were positioned at each intersection. And so before we had access to some of that, three-dimensional measured drawing of the last renovation of the street, I, along with Jackson, pre-worked where the bodies were buried in terms of possible obstructions. And then once we started working with the measured drawings of the street and reworking them, modifying them, was sort of about, penning out, with the virtual drawing, if you will, of how each of those individual measurements mapped to the design intention from the last renovation of the street that began in the aughts.
But so you tell us what a CAD model is and how that played in.
Good point. So CAD is, as I understand, computer-aided design. It's just sort of, jargon for how you would put an architectural measure drawing inside. It's how you manipulated it inside a computer. So it's a line drawing or a 3D drawing that has dimensional measurements attached to it. So it provides a way to record in a sort of holistic form all of those measurements that you had been taking in person and connect them up to all the really important design characteristics that have to ultimately be addressed when something is built, like the radius of corners and the precise position of underlying infrastructure like water mains and electrical conduits and things like that.
And so you were able to use this essentially sophisticated, you might even think of it as mapping software, right? A map of where every little curb is and tree and manhole cover and ramp and what materials they are. And you went through each foot of Beacon Street to figure out if the path would fit. Is that what happened?
That's pretty much right. And I want to emphasize this was the sort of our preliminary study. And now there's a further study that was commissioned by the town based on a request from town meeting from 2018, autumn of 2018. And now Tool Design are under contract to the town. They are transportation and engineering and landscape architecture consultants to do a more complete version of what we had done preliminarily. But you're exactly right. The project was to essentially figure out how the existing conditions of Beacon Street might permit a path, and also to update the last time engineers had drawn a model of the street, which was in the end of late 90s.
So I'm going to put together some pieces because Jules, you're pretty casual about a rather remarkable series of fortunate events, right? So Brookline has this guy who really cares about non-motorized transportation and happens to have these technical skills to use CAD software or to learn how to use CAD software, and is willing to put in all kinds of time to test whether this wild idea that is been proposed and sort of dismissed continuously actually works. And when you saw that it did, you said, well, I can actually sort of draw the line from Cleveland Circle all the way to St. Mary's. Then what?
Yes. Then what? So, you make a good point by implication, which is, as someone who likes to look at technical details, my impulse is, what's the technical solution? Is there a technical solution? But the truth is that the technical solution is just, like a tiny portion of actually what it would take to make something like this happen, any type of project, but especially a project, like this in the public realm. And so figuring out what was preliminarily feasible was just the beginning. The next step was then finding ways to communicate it and get it lodged, to get it checked out, the idea checked out. So that was the consultation with these different interested advisory groups within Brookline government. It was to get it checked out with town meeting to see whether the town meeting was interested. So that was actually one of the things that inspired me to run for town meeting in Brookline. But I think even once we had gotten strong support from town meeting to study this idea, the real challenge was to get everyone, to get the community to have a sense of what exactly we're talking about. Because even when you've got a CAD drawing, this sort of digital, high resolution digital map, if you will, that's not enough, I think, for people to get excited about something and to be able to like see the forest rather than just the minute, trees of individual obstructions. And so, I think the most important step after the technical work was, and I think that in some sense, the biggest part of the project was doing, with the help of DPW and police and a number of not-for-profit groups, organizing a number of public events starting at the end of 2018 and through 2019 to temporarily for one day reopen the space and position some cars moved to the side in such a way you could see and use this median space, and to invite folks to come there. We called those, there was the Envision Beacon Street events. And really, I felt like that was really essential part of moving this project forward, is getting people there to invite folks to have a chance to literally feel and look at what the place is, because it is a place. I think that's the part that I didn't think this originally. I was thinking of this in terms of transportation, but there's a place in the middle of Beacon Street that's more than just the train stops and their platforms. And I think it really helps to have folks come and stand and move through that space to get a sense of what kind of place it is. And that is so important.
So I think you're right. And I had thought of it initially as, whether or not they're wearing Lycra as, right, the narrow Tour de France Brookline style, right, where it just be bicyclists zooming through town as quickly as possible, presumably from Newton to downtown or something. But what the Envisioning Beacon Street events helped me see, because I went, is that actually what this proposal is a long linear park on the most populated street in town. We're proposing in this bridle path to put a long linear park in effectively the front yard of thousands and thousands of people who live in Brookline. Right. And when you think about it that way, you see this path as the path where parents with young children stroll and catch up with each other. The path where older adults do their slow but important and steady daily exercise routine. The path where people commute. The path where 5-year-olds learn how to bicycle. Right? All of these things happen in the same place. And in some ways, it's like the Esplanade or the Muddy River without the water. Right? A lot of things can happen there for a lot of different kinds of users throughout the day, the week, and in fact, the different seasons of the year. And so that's pretty remarkable. So we've got the town got some money, right? It got some money from Department of Conservation. I think got some money from the legislature, got a couple of different pots of money, started this study. And what's the latest?
That's right. So I want to acknowledge that feasibility study requested by town meeting, but that was just the beginning. The next step was to fund it. And the town has put up some money appropriated by town meeting from the receipts on the small tax that's applied to Uber and Lyft trips, which is required to be spent on transportation projects to mitigate the impact of Uber and Lyft trips. Another portion was appropriated by the state legislature, and it was secured by none other than my counterpart in this conversation, Tommy Vitolo, in collaboration with the other reps. And then the last part was a grant from the state, DCR and DOT. And yeah, so this feasibility study, the idea here is to give more material, another sort of level of material to enable the Brookline community to, and administrative groups like Mass DOT at the state level, to evaluate precisely how it may be possible to reestablish this pathway and sort of and the linear park place that you were talking about, Tommy. And the hope, I think, is that there's that the results from the study are going to begin to be released over the course of this summer, and with perhaps the major community engagement and results coming out towards the end of this year, if I have the dates right.
And then more recently, and I suspect you'll have the language more precise than I will, there was an earmark in federal legislation. It's hard to imagine the US Congress doing anything, but my understanding is at least part of it is interested in helping out with this project as well. What can you tell us about that part of it?
Yeah, this is an exciting new development. So Congressman Auchincloss for Massachusetts 4th Congressional District has put in a request which has made it into the bill that appears likely to pass the House very soon this summer to appropriate $2 million if it was funded to fund further work after this feasibility study regarding restoration of the bridleway. And so it's really exciting that the congressman designated this potential project as one of his member designated projects, as they're called, and that he's succeeded in securing its inclusion in the bill that was passed out of committee. So the hope, I think, is that we'll get some feedback about whether that gets included in the reconciled version of the bill in collaboration with the Senate. I'm not really sure what to expect about that process, but I'm hopeful.
And we've just got a little bit of time left, but I am going to ask if that funding comes through, does that mean like Bridle Path is done in 2023? What's the timeline for, like, a good guess for when people get to use this park that came out of your work several years ago?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I will say that, maybe if we're going to attach a time bound to it, I was hoping that perhaps when my kids graduate from high school that they'll be able to use it. And my eldest she just finished 4th grade. So if Brookline succeeds along with some federal money in achieving that, that would be a great success. And I'm hopeful that it could be much sooner than that. But I'm hopeful that it will be sooner than I worry, but maybe accepting that it might be not as fast as I wish.
Sure. And I think that's right. I think, second half of the 2020s, 2026 would be better than 2029 is kind of a nice way to think about it. Look, there's no question that Brookline and indeed the world has been rethinking about how to allocate outdoor space. There was some interest in it long before COVID, right? There were parklets and parking day and conversations like that. But it turns out that during COVID, people really liked the idea of repurposing parking spaces to be used in other ways, and rethinking where the pavement should end and use by people outside of automobiles should begin. And this is in some way a continuation of that, even though it predates that eureka or that epiphany for many folks. But in any case, it's clear that it's another opportunity to rethink where these curbs that have existed for 100 years belong and how we can use the space, where the facade of one building starts all the way to the facade of the other building, our sidewalks, our street trees, our parking lanes, our motor vehicle lanes, our park space, our MBTA space, how we allocate all of that for the benefit of the whole community. So Jules, we're at time, so I want to thank you for zooming in for this interview and for all of the work you put into it. I would say that your efforts were necessary but not sufficient. Wouldn't happen without you. Certainly, a lot of other folks have been an important part. But thank you both for your work and for coming on to give us an update.
Thanks for having me, Tommy. This has been great, and I really appreciate your contributions as well. There have been so many hands and thoughts that have gone into getting this particular project to this point, but it's going to require a community effort if it's going to happen.
We're going to end on that. Thanks for watching the show. Thanks for watching Brookline Interactive Group, and we'll see you next week.